Welcome everybody. Our second speaker today is Denis Yao. Denis Yao is the co-author of a book called Hegel, Lacan, and Zizek. He is currently also the editor of Crisis and Critique. He received his graduate degree at the European Graduate School with a thesis centered on Lacan's notion of logical time. He's a member of Pensée, which is a study group that focuses on psychoanalysis, politics, and philosophy. And he's also one of the organizers of the Circle of Study of Ideas and Ideology, the North American chapter. Right now he's going to be giving a text which is titled The Space of Desire and the Economic Order. And tomorrow there's going to be a second text called Value and Appearance. Denis Yao is also a very close friend of mine, and I have the honor of having him here at the University of Michigan.
Thanks. Okay. So before I start, I just wanted to maybe draw some more connections between Gabriel's last presentation and my own, because I think it's really fruitful, these connections that he brought up. The first one is this notion of the grammar of desire, or like basically the problem as I understood it from his presentation was that the future is something which we invest a lot in, both politically and personally, and a big part of any kind of political movement or effort is to try to invent the proper grammar, the proper way of speaking about the future, because then we can use that to navigate ourselves within this future, right? Like questions of where do we see ourselves, like the classic question of the interview, where do you see yourself in 5 years? It's really important if in the market, but also politically, right? A political party is always asking itself and the people, in some sense, where do you see yourselves in some number of years? So this question, and then the way of answering that question, there's a battle for who can invent the language that will adequately describe this future. So I think this is a good entry point for psychoanalysis, because what Freud and Lacan and many others have invented is a specific grammar for understanding, for speaking of desire, which is unlike like a political grammar, is very highly personal, right? It's highly singular, the way one person speaks about how they see themselves and how they perceive the past and the present and future versus someone else. So I think it's very useful to take these ideas, these kind of broad notions of world history, and try to condense them down to just the individual level and see what of these problems can be preserved, and of the ones that we can't preserve, the ones that become somehow diluted when we shrink it down to the individual level. Like why is it diluted? And then finally, once we've mapped it down to the individual level, can we project that back into the political space itself, right? The questions that psychoanalysis raises with regards to the unconscious, desire, questions of your relationship to, the world around you, the culture you're in, and so on. So I think another point I wanted to bring up is that the title of this presentation, I chose the term space of desire, and I think as Gabriel mentioned in the previous presentation, that you have the notion of space is very important because it determines what is visible and what's not in a lot of sense, right? When you say that there's a certain space of experience, you're implying that there's an inside and outside to this space, that there are some things that we can't experience, and yet those things determine us in a certain way. So I mean, again, psychoanalysis has everything to do with this inside versus outside question, and the way in which like when we say desire is space, how is it that desire is constituted in the first place? Is it something that just comes from inside, something that is totally closed from the outside world? And then the problem becomes simply, how do we communicate our desires to others so that we can get what we want, or how do we mediate multiplicity of desires? Or what I would say is the Freudian position, which is that desire is not a closed order, but is something which it leaks into the outside world, and the outside world again leaks back into it. So there's this more complicated notion of space that Freud introduces. And then I would say the theme of this paper, the way I tie these notions of grammar and space together is has a lot to do with the question of the body, because I think psychoanalysis has this category of things called symptoms, which is, I think, precisely a space in the body, a place in the body, which manifests its own grammar, its own form of speech. So like basically, the example Gabriel uses is someone who's a part of their body stops working all of a sudden, and now you're left with the question of why at this time, why in these particular situations. So I think that we can think of all society as a body, but we can also think of the individual body as being the site for these symptoms, which have their own particular logic. So I just wanted to bring this up because I think there's a lot of affinities there when we talk about political economy. Like I'll venture to say this, that maybe there's a common point or a affinity between the problem of making sense of our place in the world, which is something that psychoanalysis might help us do, right? And every day you're trying to orient yourself in the world when you go to analysis, and that's a lot what the theory is about. Let's say it's a general theory of how to place an individual in something larger than it. Versus, on the other hand, the problem of making sense of the space in general, like the entire space itself, which I would say, from Gabriel's presentation, is more of a problem of political economy, right? Making sense of this bigger, larger thing, which usually means that individuals can't experience it directly. So there's that dichotomy. So with all of these things in mind, I think we can start the paper. And if you guys have any questions along the way, please just stop me and we can discuss. Okay. So this text is called Space of Desire in the Economic Order. In Lacan's early seminar on the ego, he uses the metaphor of a symbolic circuit to describe the way in which the human being is determined by language. He says, quote, "The discourse of the other is not the discourse of the abstract other, of the other in a dyad, of my correspondent, nor even of my slave. It is the discourse of the circuit in which I am integrated. I am one of its links. It is the discourse of my father, for instance, insofar as my father made mistakes which I am absolutely condemned to reproduce. That's what we call the superego. I am condemned to reproduce them because I am obliged to pick up again the discourse he bequeathed to me. Not simply because I am his son, but because one can't stop the chain of discourse, and it is precisely my duty to transmit it in its aberrant form to someone else." This quote captures two aspects of Lacan's conception of the other's discourse at this stage of his thought. First, this discourse both precedes the individual and includes him in it. Lacan uses the example of the father-son relation in a family, but we could well imagine that it extends to the state or any of its institutions, since it is not the blood relation itself which transmits the symbol. Recall the story Louis Althusser uses to illustrate his notion of interpolation. A policeman who passes us on the street calls out, "Hey, you there?" At the moment we turn around, we become subjects. That is, we confirm at that moment that we are one of the links in the law. The second thing Lacan's quote tells us about discourse is that not only can discourse be transmitted from one individual to another, but it must be transmitted. We are condemned to reproduce the discourse which was bequeathed to us, and this inevitability is both a manifestation of the Freudian superego and something which is part and parcel of discourse itself. One cannot stop it. Thus, we could extend Althusser's example to our contemporary issues with police brutality in America. The current excessive violence afflicting primarily black men gains its tragic dimension against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, for example, wherein the law was forced to count black skin the same as white. Yet, what was transmitted throughout the past decades was instead the aberrant form of this counting. So while segregation was officially abolished, new forms of it appeared in legal measures such as mandatory minimum sentencing and the 3 strikes rule, which disproportionately affected blacks and the poor. So this idea is an example, it's the example of how the discourse doesn't just transmit through blood relations, but can transmit itself through the social edifice, through the law itself, right? So Lacan allows us to formalize what we mean when we say systemic violence, racism, sexism, etc., in such a way that it does not rely on the psychology of individuals. The very phrase discourse of the other already implies a notion of language that is external and self-perpetuating. And Lacan's thesis is that this was implied by Freud's work on the unconscious. Lacan spent decades finding resources both within and outside of psychoanalysis to formalize this notion of language as an externalized symbolic order. We can already gather the closed, repetitive, and deterministic character of Lacan's conception of the other at this point in his teaching. This position changes as Lacan turns his attention towards the role of fantasy and the real in later seminars, but as readers of Lacan, we should always keep in mind that the symbolic dimension forms the background of the problems he articulates later on. For example, when we quote him later saying the big other doesn't exist, we shouldn't assume that the determinism of the symbolic for that reason neutralized. Another way to characterize Lacan's formulation is to call it cybernetic, insofar as it involves a certain continuation between the symbolic order and the human being. The symbolic traverses the human individual at the bodily level, and insofar as the individual serves as a link in this chain, he is no longer fully human nor fully animal. This is why there is an affinity between psychoanalysis and cybernetics. We can use the definition of cybernetics given by its father, Norbert Wiener, the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and the machine. The terms here are intentionally broad, but they imply a very specific worldview, that from a certain vantage point, human, animal, and machine are equivalent and substitutable. The cybernetic position, in effect, allows us to model humans with the same equations as machines and vice versa, and to conceive of and try to build a machine that itself thinks. So we have this notion of that Lacan's talking about of a discourse as being transmitted throughout history and the law, for example. But then we also, on the other hand, have a notion of very direct transmission in cybernetic systems of information. And so what I'm trying to do is track the development of both of these trends, because I think there's something related, right? Because in both cases what we have is determinism, two different types of determinism. So another way to characterize Lacan's formulation is to call it cybernetic insofar as it involves a certain continuation. Oh, sorry, I read this. Today, both aspects of this relation are widespread in our imagination, but its true roots can be found just after the Second World War between 1943 and 1954. incidentally the same period during which game theory was being developed by Morgenstern and von Neumann, and during which Friedrich Hayek was drawing a connection between central planning and totalitarianism. Jean-Pierre Dupuy's book, On the Origins of Cognitive Science, is an excellent historical account of the various intellectual trends, cybernetics, neoliberalism, and psychoanalysis included, which converged around the notion of subjectless processes. As Dupuy argues, the metaphysical bent of cybernetics is not so much about the humanization of the machine as the mechanization of the mind. This implies that we can produce all of the characteristics of subjectivity without supposing a subject. Another example of this from the cybernetic side would be like Turing's example of a Turing machine, right? The idea that, his imitation game, where you can basically, if his rule is like if something can act like a human, can talk like a human, it doesn't matter if it really thinks like a human. Just the external imitation of human gestures is enough to count as subjectivity. So we don't have to posit any kind of subject. Interestingly, there's also Searle's refutation of that, where it's called the Chinese room experiment, right? Where inside the room, someone who doesn't speak Chinese, who's given who's given a set of rules for if someone gives you this message, write this back, right? Write this Chinese response back. So the idea is like, yeah, that person might be able to respond to anything that's sent into the machine, this person inside the black box, but he has no comprehension. And so Searle uses that as an example of how subjectivity is still not captured by Turing's example, right? So there's that whole thing. I think Searle, if you follow Searle's argument, you get back to psychoanalysis again, in a way. So for Dupuy, modern cognitive science is haunted by its disavowal of cybernetics as its forerunner, even though they share the same problematic ideological suppositions. Instead, this relatively new science has forged an alliance with the analytic philosophy of mind. Dupuy predicts that cognitive science as an enterprise will ultimately fail unless it recognizes and analyzes its shared history with the cybernetics movement. He outlines two axioms that guided this movement. First, thinking as a form of computation, and you can see the quote here. And second, physical laws can explain why and how nature appears to contain meaning, finality, direction, and intentionality. So the cyberneticists conceived of the mind as ultimately a mechanical process and meaning as reducible to physical laws. In other words, there is no special ingredient to thinking which makes it unique to human beings. Under this paradigm, thinking can be translated into computing and knowing can be translated to simulating. We can go not so far back to enchain this line of thinking to Freud himself, who attempted to show how one can obtain qualia from a purely quantitative approach to the psyche in his Project for a Scientific Psychology from 1895. In this incredibly prescient text, Freud devises a quantitative model of the nervous system consisting of different subsystems of neurons. And from this model, he derived higher order psychological notions such as ego, wishful thinking, trauma, and so on. And dreams, for example. So we find in this tension between Freud's commitment to materialism on the one hand and his ambition to construct a theory capable of explaining higher mental phenomena, we find in this tension something that makes him a spiritual forefather to cybernetics. And this is what allows us to say that any Freudian reading of this movement would be really interesting. So the rise of structuralism in the era after Freud also borrowed ideas from the cyberneticists. Except now it was no longer subjects doing the thinking, but external trans-individual structures. So we get back to the idea from the first quote that society itself kind of functions as a cybernetic system. Right? Another quote from Dupuy. What structuralism sought to conceive in the anthropology of Levi-Strauss, for example, and particularly in his study of systems of exchange in traditional societies, was a subjectless cognition, indeed cognition without mental content. Whence the project of making symbolic thought a mechanism peculiar not to individual brains, but to unconscious linguistic structures that automatically operate behind the back, as it were, of unfortunate human subjects who are no more than a sort of afterthought. So the difference is that from the cybernetic perspective, it doesn't really matter how the processes governing thought are encountered or subjectivized, whereas this was always a primary aim for psychoanalysis, in a certain sense at least. As we will elaborate later, this reduction of thought to pure computation is precisely what renders cybernetics and its latter form, cognitive science, compatible with the logic of capitalism. For Lacan, on the other hand, the mechanization of the mind does not entail abolishing the notion of subject, but radicalizing it. Although he is interested in cybernetics precisely because it allows him to articulate the other as a machinic intelligence which operates on its own terms, Lacan's commitment is always directed towards clinical matters. Because of this, he diverges from the strictly cybernetic conclusion about intelligence and subjectivity. So the present text is basically an effort in uncovering this line of thought and projecting it into considerations of the place of human beings in the current economic order. So, for Lacan, it is only against the background of the machine-animal-human equivalence that it becomes possible to formulate what a subject is. So both his appreciation and his critique of cybernetics can be found in one of the last sessions of the same seminar. He begins by posing the question, quote, cybernetics is a science of syntax, and it is in a good position to help us perceive that the exact sciences do more, or do nothing other than tie the real to syntax. So what is semantics? That is to say, concrete languages, those we deal with their ambiguities, their emotional content, their human meaning. So by exact sciences, Lacan is referring to the highly mathematized sciences such as physics, which capture the real through formula and experiments. He compares them to the conjectural sciences such as linguistics and anthropology, which attempt to formalize human activity. Lacan isolates the difference between these sciences and the source of human meaning in the notion of chance. He says, quote, the foundation of the system is already in play. How could it be established if it didn't rest on the notion of chance, that is to say, on a certain pure anticipation which already has a meaning? Mistakes in syntax engender only errors, they are only accidents. But mistakes in programming engender falsehood. Already at this level, the true and the false are at stake. And earlier, when Gabriel presented the notion of the contraction of the speed of politics, the contraction of time inherent in the technologies that speed up things, I think we can kind of find this same idea in play. Like the accidents no longer happen within an automated system. Accidents happen at the moment of planning, the time when you're setting up the rules that the automated system will follow later on. You can still make errors at that point, and I think Lacan would agree with that you're just shifting, like the more automated things become, it doesn't mean you're getting rid of subjectivity, but you're just shifting the place of subjectivity to an earlier point. But that does create a qualitative problem in the sense that you might not be able to recognize the subjectivity then, whereas it's very apparent when you make the accident or you make the error in the moment. So Lacan's use of the term chance here should be distinguished from pure probability in the same sense that contingency is not the same as possibility. When we design a machine, we define different possibilities for it. different states with their respective state transitions, for example. But the dimension of chance is in the foundation of the system. In this case, the act of correctly or incorrectly programming the machine. If a machine operates normally, it is meaningless, but if it were to fail to start entirely, it would begin to signify something. Similarly, if the machine were to do something not predetermined by its programming, this might also produce meaning. For Lacan, then, the fact that some aspect of the functioning of the mind can be made automatic only specifies where subjectivity is not to be found, which still might be a real discovery, but it doesn't really concern psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis deals with a dimension situated outside of the machine, where contingent events are met with subjective anticipation. What the analyst looks for is not logical mistakes in what the patient says, but rather the meaning associated with chance sayings. In the same seminar from 1954, Lacan demonstrates the autonomy of the symbolic order by showing how simple, apparently random sequences can generate higher order rules. As he points out, this is a formal analog of the psychoanalytic process, which generates apparently random, simple associations from the patient in a series of sessions, which are revealed after some time to be governed by certain prohibitions. Lacan tries many formalizations of this experience, but the most exemplary of what we are calling his cybernetic phase is the famous bicycle graph in the postscript to his seminar on the Purloin letter. One of Lacan's aims with this graph is to depict how the memory of the unconscious works. For Lacan, the symbolic order itself remembers, such that along with the concept of language, which is operative outside of us, psychoanalysis also carries with it a unique concept of temporality. And there are some quotes here that I didn't include in the slides, but I'll just read them to you. This is from his decree. The 4 pages that are a conundrum here for certain people were thus not intended to be confusing. I have reworked them slightly to remove any pretext one might come up with for ignoring what they say, which is that the remembering at stake in the unconscious, and I mean the Freudian unconscious, is not related to the register that is assumed to be that of memory, insofar as memory is taken to be a property of a living being. So in his very characteristic style, he's saying something pretty simple, actually, that we can't reduce the unconscious to just individual memories. It's not like when we talk about repressed memories, we're not talking about individual memories that are possessions of an individual, but rather something which is held somewhere else. Okay, so then the second quote here, he just confirms this with the second quote. He says, what is repeated is a product not of nothing from the real, but precisely of what was not. Again, very clear quote, self-explanatory. As Lacan points out in this preface, written in 1956, many have confused his idea of unconscious memory with individual memory. The crucial difference, which he indicates in the second quote, consists of the content of this memory, which is a product not of nothing from the real, but precisely of what was not. Repetition does not arise from a presupposed lack in the real, but only from something which was absent. In other words, repetition does not repeat something substantial, but repeats to preserve the product of a loss, which is a kind of a subtle distinction sometimes, right? It's this idea that repetition is not so much about a specific content, which I think actually fits perfectly with the thing that Gabriel mentioned in the last presentation, that like what Freud said, if he really believed what his patients were telling him, he'd have to press charges on everyone in the city, because it's very easy for you to have false memories, to construct things after the fact. So you can't really draw a line between memory and repetition in that positive sense. But what you can do is to say that maybe there is this notion of loss that follows memory around, right? Maybe there is a connection between the way individuals remember things and something more constitutive, something that goes outside of the individual, which has, the best way we can approximate this thing that's bigger than the individual is a sense of loss or absence. That empty space, that absence, is what is repeated. So I think, there's that kind of subtlety at play in the unconscious, and I think from this subtlety we can kind of draw the first consequences of where he deviates from the more cybernetic reading of human beings are determined and so on. But it is not it's a pretty complicated issue, I think. So for Lacan, this sentence is important. For Lacan, unconscious memory is characterized by at least two traits. It must be independent of the individual, and it must preserve something of what does not happen. Right? And if, maybe at the end we can go into the bicycle graph, but it's all about a rule about a sequence that structurally cannot appear. So he shows that given a random selection of marks, right, pluses or minuses, for example, you would think that because it's random, eventually anything can appear, right? This idea of if you take something random and you just keep playing it out over time, eventually every possible sequence can appear. But he shows that depending on how we name these sequences, we can construct a specific sequence that won't appear. And he shows that this is something like an invariant in the very notion of random distribution. But it's hard to just describe it without going into the formalism. So discourse names this embedding of the individual in a sequence which, however random it appears, is fixed by an impossibility. Therefore, to listen to this discourse means to refer it back to this impossible point. Examples of this can be found throughout Lacan's work, but we choose the following quote, which is relevant to us because it contrasts the dimension of the symbolic with that of the economic. Quote, everyone knows that money doesn't just buy things, but that the prices which in our culture are calculated at rock bottom have the function of neutralizing something infinitely more dangerous than paying in money, namely owing somebody something. Yeah, I really like this quote because again, if we try to model human beings as feedback loops or whatever, some kind of machine in which the economy is simply in communication with, right? It fits with the idea earlier that desire is this closed thing, and it doesn't leak into the outside, and the outside doesn't leak into it. And what communication is just this very automatic thing that's transferring information back and forth between human beings and the economic world. But Lacan points out, okay, but what about the phenomena of owing someone something, like debts that are unpaid, and how that produces symptoms, how that's not accounted for in the logic of the economy. So it's here that we should introduce the main topic of the paper, that of the relation between economic order and desire. Our goal is to show that the questions Lacan was confronting are still with us in an increasingly urgent form. For Lacan, desire is always desire of the other. Like the notion of discourse, which we've just briefly investigated, desire is always partially bequeathed desire. On the other hand, we've chosen the second term to be the economic order because this signifies the particular form of self-conflict that attaches itself to desire as it is bequeathed to us today. Our desires both conflict with and owe themselves to the economy. The latter encompasses our class position and prospects of the future, but also economic theory and the way we question or do not question its status in our lives. Notions such as value, market, unemployment, debt, inflation, and prices all determine us, but they often do so from an ever-distant position. Today it is perhaps easier to talk about one's troubled relation to one's family than about one's relation to the economy. Economic theory, in its pursuit of an empirically valid methodology, generally excludes the subject proper. And leftism, as a movement historically charged with orienting us vis-a-vis the economy, seems to be itself disoriented by the failures of communism in the last century. And I think here, just to make a comment, there is something, obviously there is something very intuitive in the idea that if political economy was all about finding the general space of where human beings can go, this notion of like if we tweak these variables in society, our future will be radically different. We can go this way, we can go that way. But then what's intuitive is that if that were to fail somehow, that means we must have left something out of this machine, right? If political economy says that it's all about tweaking these things and then producing the future we want to see, the fact that that didn't work out in the 20th century, the fact that leftism wasn't able to do that, it does seem to suggest that maybe the fact of excluding the subject is something of the individual is really important, right, for this type of thinking. And I think that's where the question comes into play. Like, you have the problem of finding the general space of human existence, of societies, but you don't have any way of conceptualizing how human beings themselves relate to the market or this future. And I think that's why psychoanalysis and political economy, they often, they produce interesting thinkers that kind of go between the two. So, and Zizek is a good example, as we'll see. So, today, as Slavoj Žižek has pointed out, protests are usually not about changing the system of class domination itself, but protests against losing one's current class position. A stable job with benefits is a luxury that few can pass up. So what was called exploitation in previous struggles is now a privilege. To organize a political desire according to communist principles, that is, to advocate changing the class system itself, not only the demographics we ourselves belong to, seems unlikely, even under the banner of Bernie Sanders-style socialism. Notice that his recent universal health care bill is named Medicare for All. It is not called universal health care or even single payer, indicating that we have to relabel old categories today, both to pass censorship and to resonate with the people, at least in the United States. If we could transpose Lacan's view of desire into the political domain, perhaps it would be the following. There is never a pure desire which is not already included in a political struggle for interpretation. So in what sense does the economic order serve as the big other today, and our economists the interpreters of our desire? For example, there's a mantra today that we should do what we're passionate about. A job is not just a job, but also a way to discover ourselves And this journey of self-discovery is one of the benefits that companies now offer us. But if we examine this mantra critically, it's clear that we're more likely to be productive when we're passionate about our work. And this higher productivity translates to higher profits. It is also clear that the path to self-discovery that we're offered in the workplace does not include everything we might be interested in. A paid course in the history of philosophy or art, for example. But this is restricted again by the law of profit. So why do many companies now allow unlimited vacations and extended paid maternity leave? Not simply because it is the right thing to do, since that had always been true, but because it gives companies a competitive edge when hiring in a labor market in which it is increasingly necessary to attract specialized talent. At the same time as some companies seem to truly take care of their workers, there arise others. And those of us who are fortunate enough to have jobs in the future will likely work in the now emerging gig economy for companies that offer no benefits or stability, but completely flexible hours. In Lacanian terms, we can say that there's the other's desire to make profit and our desire to have a place in the society and to have a career. But it's impossible, for political economic reasons, to disentangle them. It is, for example, not viable to critique the desire of many who want a place in the middle class as an inauthentic desire, or as manufactured, for example. For Lacan, it is not a question of finding a desire which is independent of the other, but to introduce an additional secondary desire, to know this very relationship with the other at work in desire itself. Just had a thought about this notion of inauthentic or manufactured desire. Like Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, right? I think Lacan has something to offer to that notion. When you produce consent, as a leftist, which Chomsky is, when you say that you're manufacturing consent, aren't you in some sense also treating people as like a machine in some sense? You're manufacturing something about them which you would normally consider to be a matter of subjectivity, right? Consent to do something is very closely tied with the notion of freedom, the notion of self-determination. So the idea that you can manufacture that seems to play into this notion of a cybernetic viewpoint of the human individual. And I think Lacan offers kind of a counter to that with his theory. So again, yeah, for Lacan, it's not about trying to find a more authentic desire that breaks away from society or breaks away from this manufactured aspect, but to add a new desire, to add a secondary desire to this. So, of course, as individuals, we would rather be employed and have flexibility, benefits, and security than to not have these things. But we should also sharpen the sense in which the choices offered to us hide a more fundamental impossibility. Right? And again, this idea of what Lacan found out about listening, that to listen to the patient is to listen for something impossible, something that does not happen, does not appear, which is more important than what actually comes out. Right? So the methodology we adopt is to trace the path that cybernetics takes as it becomes integrated into the neoliberal view, and eventually the very imaginary of the self. Our first job is to synthesize what was said above into a thesis that the market models a cybernetic system. The market is conceived here as a system of price signals and mechanisms that depend on treating labor and capital as equivalent, right? Capital as the class of machines and automation that drive the economy, and labor as this more amorphous, subjective thing. So yeah, just like cybernetics treats human machine, you can see the same thing happening in the market, right? When it counts labor as a commodity. So Our second thesis is that a certain range of desires are being excluded from the system. They only appear today in what information theory calls noise. What remains is the desire to be a rational economic actor, the so-called self-interested individual. But this desire is the result of a constant effort of ideological interpolation. The rational economic actor is the ideal cyborg who is in harmony with the ebb and tide of the market. In this text, we investigate the role of such an ideal. By conceiving of desires having to pass through the economy to articulate itself, we allow ourselves the use of certain psychoanalytic concepts insofar as they deal with bodily symptoms. The intersection between the market and individuals is a site for these symptoms. So we now turn to what is maybe the paradigmatic text of free market thought, Friedrich Hayek's Use of Knowledge in Society. In this text, written in the same period that the Cybernetic movement was taking place, Hayek defines the central problem of economy as that of finding the best use of available means, right? Allocating resources. In other words, how to allocate resources effectively across time and space for the maximum benefit of society. The problem, as Hayek brilliantly argues, is that no single mind can know all relevant economic facts at once. Any planned economy is therefore inherently limited in the information it has to make proper allocations. On the other hand, the market, with its system of prices, is inherently suited for this problem precisely because it is decentralized. It does not require a central knower to grasp all economic situations at once. Rather, the relevant information is stored and propagated as the set of prices. According to Hayek, the reason that the market can unleash productive forces is because it taps into a special kind of knowledge, which is inherently decentralized and time-sensitive. He says, today it is almost heresy to suggest that scientific knowledge is not the sum of all knowledge, but a little reflection will show that there is beyond question a body of very important but unorganized knowledge, which cannot possibly be called scientific in the sense of knowledge of general rules. The knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. It is with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all others because he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made, but of which use can be made only if the decisions depending on it are left to him or are made with his active cooperation. So again, we have this metaphor of machines. I think in the sense that human beings can be calculated as something that it takes in information, outputs information in the form of price signals. And if you try to do planning ahead of time to try to organize human activity, you lose some of that information, right? You filter some important aspect of this information. Whereas Hayek believes that the market is a better tuned machine to this information because it's decentralized and it's localized, right? So you don't need to know one person doesn't need to know everything to make an effective decision. So furthermore, Hayek stresses that this type of knowledge inherently resists aggregation by statistical models. So this is perhaps also the point where I should briefly mention the fact that the sort of knowledge with which I have been concerned is knowledge of the kind which by its nature cannot enter into statistics and therefore cannot be conveyed to any central authority in statistical form. The statistics which such a central authority would have to use would have to be arrived at precisely by abstracting from minor differences between the things, by lumping together as resources of one kind items which differ as regards location, quality, and other particulars, in a way which might be very significant for the specific decision. It follows from this that central planning based on statistical information by its nature cannot take direct account of these circumstances of time and place, and that the central planner will have to find some way or other in which the decisions depending on them can be left to the man on the spot. This is a really important quote because he kind of captures what he thinks is really effective in the economy. What is really effective is these concrete circumstances, right? Which actually sounds very Marxist in a lot of ways, right? You're depend on the worker to kind of organize themselves according to their specific concrete problems and find their own solutions to things. It's just that he happens to think that the market is able to capture these decisions in a way that's useful for everyone, right? Like, in I guess his critique could be summed up like, the worker has these concrete struggles, they find solutions, but under a central planning system, any solutions they find, any, they want to get these commodities to make something that will help them, that can't be transmitted effectively to all the other nodes in the system, whereas the market is a medium for doing that. So it's this very, it's not so different from the Marxist idea of trusting in the worker, trying to give workers a more active role in the economy and so on. But of course the conclusions of they vary wildly. So continuing, it is therefore the special nature of this knowledge, its locality with respect to time, space, and economic conditions, which makes it invisible to the aggregate viewpoint inherent in a planned economy. We should first note how closely this is paralleled in psychoanalysis by Lacan's conception of speech as inherently singular. In the same way that psychoanalysis treats each patient as exceptional against the tendency by psychology to categorize them into different pathologies, the free market cybernetic viewpoint attempts to isolate and utilize the singular forms of economic knowledge. Something seems missing at this point in the jump from Hayek's analysis to a full endorsement of the free market. It consists in the relationship between the role of abstraction, the man on the spot, and the system of price signals. The paradox of Hayek's argument can be put in the form of a question. If the problem of central planning is that it abstracts too much, thus erasing the particularities of a given economic situation, in what sense is the price signal of the market not also an egregious case of abstraction? Namely, when we deal with a portfolio of commodities or stocks, are we not lumping together as resources of one kind items which differ as regards location, quality, and other particulars, as he says? Let us imagine the case where the price of some commodity is uniform throughout the market. Isn't this reduction to a single number a pure abstraction in itself? Not to mention the fact that, along with concrete items, the market allows us to purchase highly abstract financial instruments, such as insurance and derivatives. In other words, in what sense does the commodity form preserve particular local knowledge? It seems that for Hayek, the problem is not abstraction of knowledge as such, but the issue of who is doing the abstraction. So we have another quote from him. The problem is thus in no way solved if we can show that all the facts, if they were known to a single mind, would uniquely determine the solution. Instead, we must show how a solution is produced by the interactions of people, each of whom possess only partial knowledge. To assume all the knowledge to be given to a single mind in the same manner in which we assume it to be given to us as the explaining economists is to assume the problem away, and to disregard everything that is important and significant in the real world. So, yeah, I think this is important because the idea is like, you have these equations, and hypothetically, if one mind could get all the relevant information, then you have these equations, you just plug in the numbers and get the solution. But the problem is you can never collect this information into one place without losing something. but it's ambiguous. I mean, this is the core ambiguity that I'm trying to track here is what is this thing that gets lost in the process? So for Hayek then, to say that the market could be replaced by an individual mind or even multiple minds is a fallacy. But here we arrive at a clear decision point. We could read this impossibility as either an informal or logical fallacy. So the informal or empirical fallacy is to assume there exists a mind capable of processing the complexity of all economic facts. But if this were the only obstacle, then Hayek's argument would be reduced to an empirical one. So, for example, the market system is superior because in practice it has shown itself to be more efficient in capturing the true state of the economy. However, this would be missing the true import of his argument, which relies on the logical relation between a certain kind of knowledge and the economy. This type of knowledge determines the kind of system which would preserve it. To retain the true force of Hayek's argument, we should instead assert that the fallacy lies in assuming that there could exist a complete picture of the economy in the first place. This extends from the definition of specialized knowledge of the man in the spot as inherently ungeneralizable. If we could assemble these knowledges into a single picture, then we could posit a single mind to which it would correspond, whether such a mind is centralized or decentralized. But then this knowledge would not be what it is. Therefore, the complete picture of economic facts is impossible. So here I hope it makes sense, the two types of fallacies that could happen. One is to say that there's no one with a big enough mind to contain all this knowledge, which is trivially true, like no one's going to know everything and no one's going to calculate that. But I don't think central planners were ever trying to say like we're going to capture all economic information, right? So I mean that empirical fallacy that he points out is not really that strong. I think if you follow his argument closely, where he starts with this definition of knowledge as being something that cannot be generalized, then you would arrive at a different kind of position, because again, like I think the market, in its very abstraction of creating price signals, it also loses this information in some sense, right? But now the question is, okay, so let's say this market is not able to capture this information either. Then the question becomes, why is the market more effective, right? There's still, I mean, it is empirically true that the market, at least at this time, was much more efficient at organizing human activity than central planning. So can we still take Hayek's insight, but come to a different conclusion about why the market was able to be this effective? So I think that's where the paper is going. So to isolate this impossibility, the impossibility of gathering all the economic facts, to isolate this is to grasp the true role of the market, which is to hide this impossibility. Here is another quote by Hayek, which we can now read in a new light. The whole acts as one market, not because any of its members survey the whole field, but because their limited individual fields of vision sufficiently overlap so that through many intermediaries, the relevant information is communicated to all. The mere fact that there is one price for any commodity, or rather that local prices are connected in a manner determined by the cost of transportation, etc., brings about the solution which might have been arrived at by one single mind possessing all the information which is in fact dispersed among all the people involved in the process. End quote. Hayek admits that the miracle of the market is that we can act as if its prices were arrived at by one single mind possessing all the information which is in fact dispersed. So it is as if a single mind took into account the myriad of economic cases and simultaneously solved for the price of a given commodity in all those cases, right? It arrived at one price from, like, the price of bananas, which is actually representing all the different situations of the world of producers and consumers of bananas. But this is precisely what Hayek claimed was impossible in the beginning. So again, if we take his claim simply as an empirical one, we get a weaker argument. Central planning fails because hitherto all forms of it were not sufficient to handle decentralized local knowledge. But this does not preclude the possibility of creating a central planning system, perhaps with better technology, that could be sufficient. However, this would not be taking his argument at face value, which, as we've just reconstructed, is that a unified representation of the economic world is impossible. You simply cannot represent the economic world, or some aspect of it. And the market does not construct such a unification. But it is so effective that we can believe that it sees the entire economic field at once. One could argue that the single mind metaphor is just that, a metaphor, and that Hayek is just using it to demonstrate how we individuals could misrecognize market mechanisms as being an intelligent entity. But what I'm trying to ask here is like, okay, he's using the metaphor, but can't we say that this metaphor has effectivity of its own, right? Like, he's saying one thing is impossible, but one mind can't have a complete picture of the world economy. But then he says, okay, but we can act as if the market has it. So it's this weird, like, why not just say that the single mind can be, we just get rid of that metaphor altogether and just say, okay, what actually is happening is decentralized systems. Let's not try to conceive of the market as a single thing. He comes to the opposite conclusion.
Yeah, he seems to actually go for the Chinese room thing. If you send prices and you get the signal back, it's as if the market actually understands what's receiving.
Exactly. He's like he takes the Searle position.
The market passes the Turing test.
Yeah, the market passes the Turing test. Yeah, it's a very weird like thing that he does. It's a very circular thing. So, what if, however, Hayek is effectively trading one abstraction for another? That is, the egregious abstraction in central planning, which leads to a loss in situational knowledge, is traded in for the abstraction of the market as a transcendental that guarantees the univocity of prices. By univocity of prices, we mean a system wherein one cannot find the same commodity at two different prices. Of course, as good consumers, we may find exceptions to this rule quite often, which is called getting a good deal, right, when we're shopping. But when generalizing this activity of consumption, the market as a whole, again, converges on the single price. So it's not about, like, empirically, of course, we can find this one commodity at a store at a different price, or like gasoline is a perfect example, right? Gas in one place is one price, and gas in another place is a different price. We experience that empirically, but yet there's this belief that there's a convergence of prices, right? Even though gas is higher in this place and lower in this place, we're able to believe on some level that it's converging, it's in the process of converging, or that there's some kind of stability of prices that is neither one of the empirical prices themselves. So this has several functions. First, the unity of the market ensures that each economic actor can already factor a global uniformity and continuity of prices into his decisions. Second, we can abstract away each individual decision such that the movement of the market appears to us as a natural phenomenon, and the actors within it can be represented as machines of nature, right? Cybernetic construct. Third, we can believe that the economy is a closed order which can be treatable in mathematical terms alone. The second and third processes work in tandem to depoliticize the decisions made in the first process. Right, basically, the second two processes allow businesses to operate as if they were operating with natural things, right? Labor becomes another resource like land or whatever. And everything can be treated as mathematically consistent. So, in short, we agree with Hayek that the market has power to dynamically record and regulate itself according to decentralized economic activity, but we are adding that this depends on its ability to evoke a closed naturalized, and mathematizable order which we, as its subjects, can believe in. When we say that the whole acts as one market, we are evoking a belief and not a fact, because of Hayek's premise that to aggregate economic facts in one place is impossible. Yet, by adding this belief, the market appears to function precisely as one mind. What we are approaching in these considerations is the properly symbolic function of the market. That is, we are not concerned with simply the rational economic calculation, but also with the dimension of the symbolic other, which holds the key to our desire. And I wanted to just point out another connection to what Gabriel is saying about the king's two bodies. This idea that in the past, when you looked at the king, you saw the whole, right? I mean, the market has that. That's basically what I'm saying with this belief. To treat the market as one whole is also to treat society as one whole, right? When you see a price, a single banana, for example, you see in it a reflection of all the processes of production, right? Or at least you can believe that all these processes are unified in some sense. So I think, there's some connection there between the king's two bodies and this more chaotic cybernetic thing. So what we are approaching, as Tom McGowan points out, capitalism gives clear answers to the question, what does the other want from me? So, quote, when I examine the field of possibilities for my life's work, the choice seems impossible. I could devote myself to medical research, stock trading, exploration of the cosmos, garbage collection, the study of history, or an almost infinite amount of other options. But when I look for the absence of career opportunities for history professors and the bevy of stock traders, the choice becomes clear. Even those who lack the privilege of choosing a career and must simply decide where to apply for a job receive guidance from the market, which tells them to apply at Walmart rather than at a local bookstore. Free market rescues me from the horrible freedom of having no grounds for deciding what I desire to take up as an occupation. End quote. So a price signal is not just a tool that enables us to maximize utility, but can also guide us to our life's work. And this is not just a cynical observation that what I perceive to be my calling is just a simple egotistical calculation, but also contains a truth insofar as we usually only discover our true calling after first attempting to survive. We can add McGowan's observation to Hayek's analysis. The man in the spot is himself captured in the price signals for another man in the spot, the capitalist, who treats the former as just another commodity, another economic fact to be considered alongside others. Right? So again, that's something important. The man in the spot, all of the facts that they consider includes other people in the spot. And then if you generalize that idea, then is any man in the spot really deciding, right? Then you have the whole question of class introduced into this equation. So McGowan takes this line of argumentation even further. He posits that capitalism parasitizes desire insofar as it entices subjects to misrecognize the true source of satisfaction. This is one reason why exploitation is no longer perceived as such, because it produces a secret satisfaction which McGowan identifies as the enjoyment inherent to sacrifice. This is really important argument. Following his argument, the reason that we sacrifice our time, our bodies, and our relationships to accumulate commodities is not for the commodities themselves, but for the repeated act of sacrificing itself. Sacrifice for sacrifice's own sake. However, capitalism is based on the deception that the commodity offers something beyond this enjoyment of sacrifice. This explains their mysterious, sublime quality. The commodities that are the most coveted in our society are not the most useful ones, but the ones that evoke an absence of self-interest. Quote, When we look around at our dwellings at the end of our lives and survey all the commodities that we have accumulated, we often come to the insight that they amount to nothing but a heap of worthless junk. Like most insights that come as one approaches the end, this one is entirely misleading. The fact that the commodities were worthless junk from the beginning is what gave them their sublimity and what gave us enjoyment in accumulating them. No one values accumulating useful things. The collector, who is a derivation of the capitalist bent on total accumulation, always collects items with no use value. Old stamps, empty beer cans, baseball trading cards, and so on. One doesn't collect useful items because there is no enjoyment attached to their accumulation. One doesn't collect useful items because there is no enjoyment attached to their accumulation. Though capitalism preaches self-interest, the enjoyment that it offers, the enjoyment of the sublime commodity, is an enjoyment that depends on the absence of self-interest. Capitalism posits a future where desire can be reconciled by accumulation or consumption, and thereby allows us to postpone the traumatic encounter with our enjoyment. On an ideological level, it does this by drawing a tautology. Namely, if a new commodity is created and people buy it, then there must have been a pre-existing need for this commodity. An argument McGowan attributes to David Ricardo. Quote, Ricardo's logic cannot be countered because it is perfectly circular. Capitalism gratifies human desires, but it is only through the free market that we can know those desires. Ricardo never articulates the nature of human desires prior to their fulfillment, which renders his solution so elegant and utterly unrefutable. Again, we find the same Turing thing again, because it doesn't matter if people really desire the things that they desire. The fact that they buy them is enough to say that they desire them. So again, you have this black box. Humanity is this black box where their actions reflect everything that's relevant to the situation, right? So again, the treatment of the human body as like a cyborg that's integrated into this system. So thus we can draw a line connecting the naturalization of capitalism as the economic order and the naturalization of desire itself. The modeling of the individual as a rational actor who attempts to maximize self-interest is founded on the assumption that self-interest is something which arises naturally. For Lacan, however, the fundamental character of desire is that it is always, at least minimally, imposed from elsewhere. Recall how American advertisers were fascinated by the possibility of using psychoanalysis to create demand, going so far as to hire Freud's nephew. The job of marketers is precisely to figure out how to impose a desire, usually by creating some imaginary lack in their advertisements. What we need then is a thorough denaturalization of desire as it is constituted by the economic order. The first step is to accept that the notion of self-interest is not a consistent notion. The self is not a privately constructed being, but inherently public. Another quote from McGowan. Quote, the public world disturbs the psychic equilibrium of the subject, but this disturbance is the source of the subject's satisfaction. It inaugurates subjectivity by installing an obstacle for the subject that begins its desiring. The subject experiences the obstacle as a barrier to its desire, but it is this obstacle that constitutes the desiring subject. The subject depends on the public world for the obstacle that enables it to desire, even though this obstacle at the same time makes the subject's desire impossible to realize. End quote. In other words, to build a system where desires are pre-given in private, as in the case of the neoclassical description of the human individual, is to make category error regarding desire. Desire relies on an obstacle, and any attempt to remove this obstacle would destroy desire as well. As McGowan correctly observes, this obstacle, which is the mainspring of desire, originates in the public space, another name for the symbolic order. And here you can connect his idea of public space with the previous idea of sacrifice, and then that first thing, the quote by Lacan about owing someone something, right? All three of these, the logic of sacrifice, the logic of a public space, and the logic of owing someone something, they don't fit the notion of information, because they're not something which arises as something which like can be factored into, like it doesn't work the same for everyone, right? Different people count sacrifice differently, or they count debts differently. In different cultures, for example, you can deal with these debts in different ways. So any attempt to try to factor these symbolic effects into the market, you'll lose that. So I think here is another way we can go back to Hayek and reread him, saying like the information that's being lost is of the symbolic, right? There's some symbolic dimension to human activity which cannot be captured by a purely informational approach, or purely cybernetic approach. So the deep insight of psychoanalysis is that although there is an obstacle which serves to prevent us from reaching full satisfaction, it is also equally what drives us. So when we attempt to project the neoclassical model into the Lacanian universe, we find that it is precisely a theory of the obstacle, what Lacan calls the object small a, that is missing. This missing theory, if we were to project it back into economics, may also account for why utility is marginal. Economics takes this fact for granted as something inherent to the way that human beings relate to the external world. For example, the first bite of cake is the best, then it goes downhill from there. The marginal character of utility therefore attests to how, the more we consume of something, the less capable it is of sustaining our desire. And this indicates that what we desire is not presence, but absence. Or this can be another alternate reading of that phenomenon. And even more so, psychoanalysis delineates an entire field of phenomena called the sexual, which contradict this diminishing returns theory. Namely, there are things which never diminish in their utility precisely because they are already useless. Right? The thing that McGowan was saying about collecting things. It's not for their use. But precisely because they are absent of utility, they are infinitely useful at sustaining our desire. So when one reads a good book, or watches a good film, or listens to a good album, the second or third time, it is in no way diminished, but often appears even better than the first time. By contrast, something useful in the ordinary sense does not provoke our desire, it just fulfills a need. Say a pill which fulfills our daily nutritional requirements. Capitalism is well aware of this, which is why advertisements do not simply list the benefits of a product, but must evoke a sense of adventure or excitement. However, as we've already discussed, its way of provoking desire relies on a future satisfaction. And the notion of future is, again, really important, right? How to map the future. And I think advertising offers a specific mapping of that space, of what you can expect in the future. Psychoanalysis teaches us the discipline of recognizing and putting into play the satisfaction which is already here. Another way to say this is that psychoanalysis allows us to ask the question, what is the use of use? And to orient our desire around this very question. The fundamental imperative of capitalism is not simply to make profit, but to create private spaces. These are spaces wherein desire can be purified of its otherness. When we invoke the self-interested individual, we are presupposing that the self constitutes a system originating from nature. The market is viewed likewise as a machine which attunes itself to the demand signals produced by individual selves, which along with other information encoded in prices, determines the optimal allocation of resources. The existence of private desire is therefore a postulate that is required for the communication between individuals in the market, and privatization is expanding this channel the channel for this communication, right? Using like information theory, you can expand this channel, allow more information to go through. The problem is that privatizing desire is tantamount to stripping it of its essential trait, which leads to the dissolution of desire itself. The public space symbolic order is an obstacle to private self-interest. It is that which links our desire to our Father's desire, but also insofar as there is a difference between the biological father and the symbolic father, it links us irreducibly to public institutions. One such institution is the school, for example, which takes on the function of the father as we grow older and leave the inner circle of our families. It's here that we encounter the first obstacles to our private self-interest, or usually at least. As kids, we may want to play computer games, watch TV, or browse the internet, which, by the way, none of those are natural inclinations, right? Because, again, those things have developed at a specific time. But we are told instead to do our homework, which might consist of trying to prove that the interior angles formed when a line intersects two parallel lines add up to 180 degrees. If we accede to this, at that point our desire is momentarily linked up to Euclid's desire, and suddenly we are traversed by the symbolic order. If instead we decide on the basis of self-interest that we will never need to understand the significance of the parallel postulate, then we deprive ourselves of a whole class of mathematical desires later in life. The fact that there are mathematicians, and that some are also even economists, is living proof that self-interest, interpreted in this narrow neoclassical sense, cannot be the determining factor of desire. So the antagonism between public and private space is part of what Zizek calls the problem of the commons. Zizek's theory of the commons can serve as a link between his early and later works, as well as the key to understanding the inconsistency of the economic order. Zizek begins his first major work, The Sublime Object of Ideology, with the question, how did Marx invent the symptom? That is, in what sense does Marx anticipate Freud in his analysis of the commodity? The answer lies in Marx's procedure. He approached the problem differently than previous classical economists, political economists. So this is a very important quote by Marx. Political economy has indeed analyzed value and its magnitude, however incompletely, and has uncovered the content concealed within these forms, but it has never once asked the question why this content has assumed that particular form. That is to say, why labor is expressed in value, and why the measurement of labor by its duration is expressed in the magnitude of the value of the product. Right? There's something incommensurable between labor and value, but it was kind of hidden, right? This incommensurability is just you just consider it to be a continuity, right? Labor flows into value and back and forth, right? Which is true of a lot of commodities, right? It seems like for a lot of commodities, how useful that commodity is can kind of go between how valuable it is, roughly speaking. But so this kind of continuity between the physical properties of a commodity and its value on the market, that's something that Marx is saying that all the political economists before him have presupposed. So Marx says, in other words, that the proper way to understand value is to question critically the relationship between labor and the final product. Economists before him already uncovered the fact that labor determines the value of products, and so Marx did not invent the labor theory of value, but he was the first to question the logic of the commodity form, which not only adds a new property to labor, exchange value, but enables a new mode of thought, namely commodity fetishism. Zizek traces this procedure to the point where Marx uncovers a new type of reality, ideological reality, which depends on a certain non-knowledge of its participants to exist. To go from this ideological reality to the reality of the symptom, right, to go from Marx back to Freud, one only needs to show how the former always includes its own obstacle as one of its elements. The hallmark of every ideology is to name some imperfection which, once erased, would install unity or harmony in society. And this imperfection is the symptom, an irrational element which completes a given reality only by subverting it. Quote from Zizek. Quote, how then can we define the Marxian symptom? Marx invented the symptom by means of detecting a certain fissure, an asymmetry, a certain pathological imbalance which belies the universalism of bourgeois rights and duties. This imbalance, far from announcing the imperfect realization of these universal principles, that is, an insufficiency to be abolished by further development, functions as their constitutive moment. The symptom is, strictly speaking, a particular element which subverts its own universal foundation, a species subverting its own genus. In this sense, we can say that the elementary Marxian procedure of criticism of ideology is already symptomatic, right, in the sense of systematic reading. It consists of detecting a point of breakdown heterogeneous to a given ideological field, and at the same time necessary for that field to achieve its closure, its accomplished form. End quote. So this is why public spaces of every kind, up to the state itself, are the symptom of capitalism. They are viewed by, for example, neoliberal ideology as impediments to the efficiency of the market. The inconsistency of this view can be detected in the opposing features we find ascribed to the government. It can never get anything done on time and under budget, but it is also dangerously efficient at oppressing and stripping us of our rights. It is simultaneously filled with bureaucrats who don't care about real people, and yet is going out of its way to support the laziest among us with welfare and so on. And then there's the ultimate Hayekian claim: if we could just remove the state's interference, there would no longer be any economic crises. Yet the state is what enables the free market to operate by setting down a complex network of legal rules, enforcing property rights, mediating disputes, and providing public infrastructure. It is therefore a point of breakdown heterogeneous to the free market, and at the same time necessary for that field to achieve its closure. This also explains Zizek's continued emphasis on communism, not as an answer to capitalism, but as the name of a growing problem which is generated by capitalism. In his book from 2011, Living in the End Times, Zizek identifies 4 deadlocks which cannot be resolved within the framework of capitalism: ecological destruction, biogenetics, the enforcement of intellectual property, and growing socioeconomic divisions. Each of these 4 horsemen are irreducibly public spaces and pose corresponding questions of sovereignty. Who will defend our shared habitat? Who will dictate changes in our shared genome? Who will draw the lines of ownership of intellectual works, or decide if these lines should be drawn at all? And finally, who will decide on questions of inclusion and exclusion in the social space? Right? Zizek says that the market can't make these decisions, or if it does make the decisions, it's not going to be good for us. The current model has been the market plus nation state. As Zizek has shown, the latter is woefully equipped to counter the globalized, decentralized power of the former. Each economic crisis forces nations to implement more austerity measures and less regulation, putting ever more money and faith into the market to restore equilibrium. It becomes apparent that the state, as the highest representative of the public sphere, must sacrifice itself and its institutions to save the market. However, this suicidal act would destroy the market itself. We propose instead that economics as a discipline must be reinvented. The neoliberal position that the market can self-regulate without crises, that it inherently benefits the world, must be refuted. The market is not a system which maximizes utility, but an emergent system which obeys its own laws. To bend or change these laws, we must augment our understanding of how they emerged in the first place. But this is not without precedent. Since the 1950s, the 4 C's, cybernetics, catastrophe, chaos, and complexity theory, have already enacted a shift from the machine metaphor to biological systems, or higher order complex systems. So we should not avert our eyes from Hayek's vision of the market, but instead radicalize it. Second, we should supplement or replace the microeconomic model of the individual with one which takes into account the problems of desire and drive introduced by Freud and Lacan. Instead of positing private individuals competing over scarce resources, or instead of just positing private individuals competing over these resources, game theory models should include the other itself as one of the actors, which may lead to solutions in previously unsolvable coordination problems. And that's it.
Are there any questions?
You did mention you were gonna draw the graph of desire.
Or the bicycle graph.
Oh, sorry, sorry, bicycle graph, yeah.
But what for?
He mentioned it earlier on that you wanted to get into that one.
Oh, if you guys want, we can talk about the bicycle graph, which is how Lacan depicts unconscious memory. But I mean, it's really involved. So only if you guys really want. It would take some time.
I just wanted to remind you. You mentioned in the because
yeah.
in the paper you didn't really explain what that was. So I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I can write it real quick. I mean,
Maybe a crash course in it so I can understand what that is.
yeah. I mean, basically, where is this? Okay, so Lacan begins with actually a story, the seminar on the foregoing letter, and within that story there's a game that's introduced called odds and evens, where you basically try to guess if two people play and one person thinks of a number, and then you just think is that number odd or even, right? So it's just 2 options, and the goal is to basically outguess the other person. So it's this really basic game. And Lacan is trying to show with the bicycle graph that even a game like that, which seems to be completely ruled by chance, can have a certain structure that you can depend on. So he starts with, instead of odd or even, he uses, there's many ways you can formalize it, but one way is to do pluses and minuses, right? So you can just do as many, just as a random sequence of pluses and minuses. And so from this, it seems that there's no way you can predict anything about this chain. But what Lacan does, he adds a second layer onto this by bracketing every three signs, so that you create groups of 3. And he then classifies these groups of 3 into specific, he gives them names. So for example, I don't remember exactly his formulation, but you have like plus, plus minus, and minus, minus plus. If you get either of these 2, you call it this, right, alpha, and then beta would be something like plus, minus, plus, or minus, plus, minus, right? They kind of have the same structure, right? 2 of the same, 1 different, 1 other, 1, right? Well, like delta, I forget, something like, you can do, all the same, for example, plus, 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 minus, 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 and then gamma, I don't remember how to do gamma, but let's see, something like, what's left over here?
Minus plus 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 minus minus.
Right, exactly. Minus plus 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 minus minus. Right. So this exhaustively describes all possible sequences of derivatives. So Lacan shows that if you were to bracket this chain of random signs, you would, and if you call them these things, you would be able to draw a structure where going from one to the other, there's not always one way to go from. Sorry, there's at least one path that's impossible, going from one to the other. So, for example, plus plus minus, if I add a plus to it, I will get beta, plus minus plus. So let's write that out. Just to be clear. So plus plus minus. Right now we're in alpha, right? If I add a plus here, then, and I bracket this, then what I've just created is a beta. So I went from alpha to beta on this higher level, the second order, right? Alternatively, if I had added this, plus minus minus, I would have gone to gamma. So I could have either gone to beta, or I could have gone to gamma, right? And then so on. So he shows, giving all these different ways of traveling from alpha to beta to gamma and delta, he shows that there's one path that can never happen.
You could never get, but no matter what you add as the fourth term, you will never get to delta, for example.
Yes.
You either go from alpha to 1 or to gamma or to beta, but never to delta.
Perfect, yeah.
So you cannot say what's coming next, but you can say what's not coming next.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So the reason he calls it a bicycle graph is because, with alpha, gamma, delta, and or beta, what you end up drawing is something like a bicycle, right? You have, I don't know, maybe something like this, right? And while you may be able to go something like this, notice that there's no direct way from going from this to this, or from this to this, right? I mean, for example, this. So it looks like a bicycle, it's not fully connected. It's not a fully connected space. So from this, he discerns that because of this impossible sequence generated by the very fact of grouping these in a particular way, that what's important in the unconscious memory is not what happens, right? Because a lot of things can happen, just like in a free association. A lot of things can come up. The patient can say a lot of things, but what you're listening for as an analyst is a sequence, not exactly a sequence, but something which continues to not appear over time.
So two remarks. I mean, or I guess talking about this, right? That what the graph tells you, right, is a model, a very simple model, right?
Yeah.
Is now what's going to happen, what doesn't happen. But there's also something interesting because each, so to speak, toss of the dice, right? Each flip of the coin is completely contingent, right?
Yeah.
It can be anything. It can be minuses 700 times in a row, and you can spin in the bicycle graph in one spot, right? But while each instance is contingent, it, in conjunction with what preceded it, right? So like a retroactive necessity, or retroactive linking or counting, then delimits the future action, right?
Yeah.
So each one is like simultaneously you get something which is contingent, and then which, in virtue of its embedding with what preceded it, determines what in the next moment is impossible, which is a strange sort of conjunction of contingency, determination, and negative delimitation, right?
Yeah.
It's a really, I guess the weird thing would be to ask, I was wondering the way you would tie this into the way you look at Hayek when you talk about, at certain moments it almost sounds like the argument is along the lines of, even though the blind and the naked hand of the market, or what's the
invisible
hand of the market.
The naked hand would be pretty good, but it's just invisible.
But the invisible hand of the market doesn't exist. It exists insofar as you believe it. Just the fact that you believe in it existing seems to be enough.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure how, but it seems to me like there's something there. But in that example, that might be able to help us answer the question of these elements are involved in the bicycle graph, is there one that takes precedence over the others, right? Is it the sort of the negative delimitation of what comes first or what comes next that's most operative? Is it the retroactive element? Is the contingent element? Because if the empty hand or the invisible hand of the market has some function, although it strictly speaking doesn't exist sort of on its own, like it appears as if like the thing which is present is absent or something like this, the thing which is invisible plays a functional role, like it produces effects, right? It sets the stage really, much more so than the other elements, right?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is exactly what Marx identifies in the quote, that something what is it in political economy that consistently fails to appear? It's something about labor. Something about labor cannot be counted in the fluctuations of the market. And I think that's where, I think that's how you might connect this thing about anticipation and contingency and the determination. I don't know if that answers.
I know it's something that I'm not sure if the question in my head is clear enough to limit an answer.
Just to connect with what he said, but also ask a couple of questions. First, from what I understand, it's not that for Smith or Hayek, market is something you need to believe in for it to work.
Yeah.
That's actually a secondary thing.
Yeah.
It's true that once you understand that there is some level of equilibrium in the way that exchanges go on, you can take that into consideration when you make your next move. That's actually something you include here.
Yeah.
So it's actually, there is a lack of a theory that includes the model, a lack of a model that includes the belief in the market as part of the effectivity of the market.
Yeah.
That's not what we use to make
Right.
predictions. In fact,
Exactly.
we exclude that in order to make the prediction. So the theory that people believe in the market, that's why it works, is not exactly what these guys are aiming at. They're aiming at that this really is indifferent. Like there is actual information being gathered by these things. And I think you make a very strong case for a more subtle critique of this, where it's not a matter of discrediting market structures, but rather understanding that there are many elements in this form of systematization that are being left out by this sort of more naive understanding of what's going on, right?
Yeah.
But I have a lot of questions to ask you, but I'm not sure. Just a couple of points I'd like to hear you talk about them, especially since you already made an effort to connect your text to what we were previously discussing. It seems like there is a first thing that I thought was very, very interesting, the way you did it, that you began by saying, well, comparing it with our discussion on how the concept of future changed throughout history and how this is related to socioeconomic determinations and so on.
Yeah.
It seemed like what we were discussing in the previous debate was, how does a space constitute itself? How is a space placed?
Yeah.
Because a certain space of meaning or a certain way of understanding things, a certain dynamic is in fact placed, geographically placed, temporally placed. And your question is the opposite, which is, what is a place in a space?
Yeah.
Right. Your problem is, how do you situate? And then you mentioned the individual, but perhaps this is looking for the place of the individual, the best way to understand the dynamics and so on. So it seems like it's the inverse question in that sense. Not that they are not compatible or equally, they don't relate to each other, but it seems like it's in between the two questions that something very special comes into play, which is the way that you constructed this. You by going from the question of scale, so individual and collective, and price as a mediation of that, or going towards the future in a matter of making predictions about the future based on certain proposals concerning what is a natural expectation, what can you naturally ground your beliefs in. So if you believe rational agents are what compose the market, you'll predict things and wage risk based on that. So you propose, when you join these things together with the problem of the other, what you're saying is that the space of what is other to us in a particular economy is different from the space of otherness in another system. So there is a very weird question about what is the shape of the other in a given space.
Yeah.
The other perhaps could have other
Yeah. I
other
think
shapes.
Yeah.
Like for example, you could. It's not a matter that things happen in one way or another, but the place or how you suppose things can change from system to another. You could suppose things in a way, and people coordinate their behaviors around certain mode of supposition, which will then lead to certain consequences, and you could actually have a change in that.
Yeah.
So the debate on the form of how otherness works is very strange.
A very good example, which I didn't touch on that much, but I mentioned here, is the difference between a family and school, for example, or family and the market. As Lacan pointed out right at the beginning, you can think of a form of determination within the family that's very different from the form of determination in the market. And I mentioned here something like, maybe today it's easier to talk about your family problems with someone than to talk about your place in the economy, because you simply don't have the vocabulary that, like, you have things like crisis and debt and instability in the market, but that doesn't really, it's not something you can like go to an analyst and really talk about in a
It doesn't capture the failure in the spot.
Yeah, exactly. You don't capture
Suffering in the spot.
Exactly, suffering in the spot. It's much easier to talk about, for example, you gave a good example about how everyone has a good explanation for their symptoms in terms of, oh, my parents treated me this way when I was young and so on. So it's very like transparent and clear. And I thought it was very interesting that in your presentation you tracked the ideas about the symptom to their historical determinations, right? Like during the time of revolution, you had hysterical symptoms. During the time of war, it was these weird war neuroses that kept repeating. And then and psychoanalysis follows these symptoms and tries to come up with a theory that would account for all of them in a specific way. So I think exactly what you're saying, that the other, which is the point of reference for this whole thing, right? I mean, for Lacan, the bicycle graph is one of his attempts to formalize the logic of the other. I think you can think of different ways of grouping, just as you can think of different ways of grouping these sequences and producing different impossibilities. The same thing happens in the shift from family to when you go into the job market. But I think maybe it might be too quick to simply say like, okay, now let me psychoanalyze the market or psychoanalyze these structures. But I think there is something is productive in going between the two.
There is something that I mean, it's from what you said, it really, because the thing that you said that really, I mean, I have another question, very technical one, but when you say, well, what's repeated is something that is not, like, we're not interested in how past facts are still registered somehow in memory, and analysis is not dealing with that, but it's dealing that basically when you start babbling about all the things that you remember, you always don't end up saying something, and the fact that you end up not saying something, that not saying something is constantly being repeated. Exactly. You fail to say something many times. And you end up marking that with I can't, I don't, and so on. What I find very interesting is that we could definitely make it's a very bold claim, but it's a very interesting way to reverse the order, because modernity begins with a certain distinction from the past and a certain colonization of the future. We have means to think about, we know it's open, but we can project things, we can speak about it, and that's all we wanted to speak about. So in fact, there wasn't anything in the future which was not. The future was to be.
Yeah.
And the past is what is not. And no wonder that psychoanalysis connects this what is not to the past. To some sort of trauma it appears to be a figure of the past in some sense. You can talk about the presence and the relation between past and present in traumatic experiences, but it's still a matter of past and present, because this impossibility has some connection with the past structure, right? But it's funny because, as you were now saying, it seems like we're some point of inversion. So what is not is now a future, What is impossible to ascribe in whatever political discourse we have is the future, it's not the past. On the contrary, we are doing all archive works, reconstructing the past. There was never such a strong study of history as we have today. You know, everyone's personal history is ridiculously well recorded. Everyone learned how, I mean, Foucault already knew this, everyone's speaking sexuality like everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's that dimension of economy that concerns the future, which everyone is aphasic about.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to imagine what would be an interpretation that touches on what is not as it's connected with a past grammar. What would it mean to interpret in the analysis of people who have no future, and not so much analysis of people who cannot speak about their own past?
Yeah.
When we were trapped in the past, previous situations was that you went through stuff when you're a kid that's not very Victorian. Like, you experimented, you know, with your crayons, with your dog, with your friends, and that wasn't really easy to speak about. These days you have like book clubs about it, you go and talk about it, like you bring your dog from your childhood. So the weird thing that has no place is actually the future.
Yeah.
So it would be a strange.
Yeah, but I think that is interesting that along these lines that when we talk about the past these days, it's totally acceptable to say it was like contingent, that things could have been otherwise. And that's another way of saying that is like, since it could have been otherwise, there is nothing that could not have been. There's no impossibility in the past. Even though, okay, the past is a fixed thing, things happen one way and didn't happen another way. But
So this has been challenged these days.
Yeah, exactly. It could have happened another way. We're not lacking in imagination when it comes to thinking of different paths, alternate paths. But we have this limitation of thinking the future, alternate futures. So yeah, definitely, I think this logic, we have to figure out how it is we can transport this logic of Lacan's into this conception of the future. And is that still valid? Is that still psychoanalysis even? Because, I mean, all forms of psychoanalysis until now have always emphasized the past and always emphasized chronological, putting things in order in the past and seeing what happens. So what would a psychoanalysis of the future be? Is that even a thing?
Is that even a thing?
Yeah.
So just one question of clarification. If I am I remembering this correctly, that in the bicycle graph, the way that Lacan has it is that each moment, each node sort of along both of the wheels and the pieces that connect them and so on, is missing the central, like the second element. It's the second element which is unwritten, right?
Yeah.
And then if the prediction is that,
yeah.
right, depending on what's tossed far ahead like this, it's the one that retroactively fills it up, right? So you have plus, space, plus, and then you have a couple of different options where the cycle can go, and one of them has a minus, so one of them has a minus minus, one has a plus, and it's depending, it's the, whatever the future element is in the next node, that when you collapse the two pieces, that would fill in the middle piece of the present one, is the way that it goes, right? Is that, am I remembering?
Yeah, I think that's the second part of his. First, he constructs this and shows that there's a sequence that can't be created, right? And then he adds, what if we skipped one?
Yeah, like what if the middle one is missing, so that, and that if you assume that the middle one is the present moment, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain absence in that, right? And it's not determined only by what preceded it, right? That's, you already know that to some extent, but it's the different possibilities. It's the different possibilities in the future that will then define the present moment, right? Because the middle of the present is underdetermined, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's relevant.
That seems to suggest a little bit like, if there's still something in the present which is somehow absent, right?
Yeah.
And then it's, you're depending on something in the future to sort of give definition to the present.
Yeah.
If the future itself is, you know, a bit of like an empty space or like a blur, it.
Even the present becomes.
Like the graph itself seems to suggest that there's a dependence of the present on the, not just in the past but also in the future, and that it creates a certain
it anticipates that you will retroact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure if that. Maybe we could say like.
Maybe we should experiment with bicycles when we were children, not just with. All right.
It was going so good, and then
it's
this
a good question. Until then. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, you know, there's this whole phenomena of anxiety and panic, depression, and stuff. Which, I mean, you know, just the really naive examples, like, you know, if you're given too many choices, it's a common reaction to feel like overwhelmed by that these days. It's very easy. You have on the market, you have so many choices of things. So that can be kind of a way, a metaphorical way of saying, like, the future's not fixed, and so the present becomes, you know, something unbearable about the present.
And there's like a lack of orientation in the present in virtue of this. I mean, this pushes back to the earlier talk a little bit as well, with the openness of the future. The determination of that actually produces almost sometimes potentially paralyzing consequences in the present. Right?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, but I
You
would,
have all these choices, but something's still not appearing. But the fact that you have all these choices